Hi, my name is Tess Collins, and this presentation is a review of my experiences for my internships for the ELPA program at East Tennessee State University. I chose two sites for my internships. First, East Tennessee State University with the Office of Student Affairs, specifically with the Assistant Dean of Students, and second, with Northeast State Community College, also within the Office of Student Affairs, specifically with the Office of Equity and Compliance. My first internship site, ETSU, I worked with the Office of Student Affairs. I wanted to work in some type of capacity with students and especially in support services. This led me to work with Dr. Michelle Bird, the Assistant Dean of Students. We focused a lot on case management related projects where I researched for a case manager position proposal. I also attended care team meetings, which were biweekly meetings where possible at risk or students of concern are discussed. The members of this team included representatives from student housing, campus police, the counseling center, and student health. Project overview. I worked with higher education case management models, researched case management positions at various universities, worked with threat assessment tools, and researched behavioral intervention teams and student support models. The core competencies I addressed were problem analysis, measurement and evaluation, legal and regulatory applications, and policy and political influence. The first core competency I addressed with East Tennessee State University was problem analysis. For example, early intervention with students. When you work with students, you need to analyze the best practices for supporting students. So, for example, what are their needs? How is it affecting their or someone else's safety? What can administration do to prevent further threat? And what interventions are appropriate? This was all addressed when I attended the care team meetings and through my various discussions with Dr. Michelle Bird. I was able to see how administration and student affairs really work to analyze some problems that students were facing and also that campus could be facing. I also got to see how problems were addressed through judicial proceedings as well as crisis response and procedures. Assessing the best level of response is something that was really difficult to analyze because crisis is hard to assess. I was able to address the measurement and evaluation competency through reviewing threat assessment tools and was able to see how they were applied in a higher education setting. By sitting in at the meetings with the care team, I was able to see how administration assessed risk levels of student support and needed interventions. I also familiarized myself with the National Behavioral Intervention Team Association and reviewed and researched documents that were helpful in measuring risk for students and campuses. I also familiarized myself with how to evaluate effectiveness of interventions for retention risk and or violence towards self or others. This is something that the care team and the Assistant Dean of Students does throughout the year with students of concern. I also saw how leadership and team takes place when evaluating services and policies that can support student and campus safety. For example, the crisis response policy. For the legal and regulatory applications part of this internship competency, I familiarized myself with FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, as well as HIPAA with Student Counseling and Health Services. This was really important to note when working with students who may be in distress because sometimes a student may go to a counseling center and will be covered by HIPAA, and then they're also covered by FERPA. So it was interesting to see how these two came into play together and sometimes also contradicted each other. So, for example, if a student was in counseling already, that information could not be shared in the care team unless the student had consented. If they were sent for an alcohol checkup or a mental health exam, then they could sign a consent and the Dean of Students would know more about their mental health. However, if they did not, none of that information would be shared because of HIPAA, so they were protected for that. I also was able to see a little bit about how liability could come into play when you're working with distressed students or when you're monitoring a student behavior, when you may have a student that's acting out in class or students that are coming into the library. So that was an interesting aspect to see, and I felt helped me really grow in this area of legal and regulatory applications. And finally, addressing the policy and political influence competency, I was able to learn the history of case management. The first case management can be traced back to 2000 with the University of Miami, but became more important and there was a movement after the Virginia Tech shootings. Case management was utilized for better ways to have early intervention and decrease the chance of violence and address distressed students, not only for mental health, but for overall resources, academic concerns, financial concerns, and any students that may be acting out in class or displaying signs of suicide ideation or issues with even their roommate in housing. Additionally, I familiarized myself with policy, specifically student disciplinary policies. I was able to learn offenses and sanctions through student conduct. Oftentimes, a student would be have a care report, but may also be facing a judicial offense. Finally, what was most interesting in my research was I learned a public health approach to prevention and early intervention, addressing overall student wellness initiatives integrated into case management. Overall, I really liked my learning experience with ETSU and the Office of Student Affairs. I'm really interested in one day possibly becoming Dean of Students, and through this internship, I was able to see the many departments that are involved in student affairs and student support. I also became aware of the importance of prevention and early intervention and coordination of care when supporting students. I learned the significant role care teams or student behavioral intervention teams have on supporting students of concern and assessing threat. I also familiarized myself with policies most used in student affairs, such as conduct violations. I also researched uses for case management and the layers of individuals and departments supporting and monitoring students, thus creating a proposal for a possible case management position at ETSU with the Office of Student Affairs. I also learned crisis response procedures and reporting systems for student of concern. This experience overall will really help me with my career and future research, hopefully with maybe threat assessment and crisis response or any student health services. My second internship site was with Northeast State Community College with the Office of Student Affairs and the Office of Equity and Compliance. My mentors were the Vice President of Student Affairs, Matt DeLozer, and Chief Advancement Officer, Equity and Compliance Officer, Dr. Lee Hornsby. I chose Northeast State Community College because I had not had any experience with a community college before, and also with my interest with Title IX and the Clery Act. I have a history of working with survivors of trauma, and I am really interested in the culture of interpersonal violence in higher education. The first project I did was policy and procedures review. This just familiarized myself, and I gave some feedback regarding discrimination policies and sexual misconduct policies, as well as judicial procedures handling sexual misconduct. Second, I researched interpersonal violence prevention. And then I also did Northeast State compliance with Title IX and the Clery Act, including VAWA amendments, and the SAVE Act. The core competencies addressed were policy and political influence, legal and regulatory applications, as well as measurement and evaluation. For the policy and political influence competency, I learned how Title IX, the Clery Act, and VAWA amendments and the SAVE Act are enforced among campus communities. Title IX addresses discrimination policies on campus and steps to respond to sexual assault. The Clery Act reports crime and security statistics and also support for victims. The VAWA amendments to Clery provide more rights for victims of sexual assault. And the SAVE Act, which is the Campus Sexual Assault Elimination Act, include disciplinary procedures and programming enforcement for sexual misconduct and interpersonal violence. The second competency, legal and regulatory, I learned how TBR regulations inform institutional policy. For example, most recently, TBR has mandated that a prevention program called Haven is required to comply with Title IX and Clery. I also learned how federal law, such as Title IX, informs institutional policy, sanctions if an institution is not compliant, how to report Title IX complaints, and judicial implications for discrimination and or violence of sexual misconduct policy. The final competency for Northeast State Community College was measurement and evaluation. First, I was able to evaluate policies related to discrimination. This really helped me understand policies, further my knowledge on how policies are created. I reviewed them from a normal person perspective, somebody who may not be familiar with policies, and gave some feedback on how they could be more clear. That was one of my first projects, and it really helped set forth my further research into Title IX and the Clery Act. I also evaluated compliance for the Clery Act and VAWA for Northeast State. So, for example, looking at their website and their policies and procedures, prevention programming, resources they have, and see if they were compliant with the Clery Act and VAWA. I also was able to explore various ways to measure campus culture regarding sexual misconduct through my research on interpersonal violence in higher education through webinars, articles, organizations that support changing the culture, which is really important because a lot of the policies created are to promote changing a campus culture through reporting, transparency, crime statistics, making sure that policies and procedures are followed correctly and there's no discrimination. Working with the Office of Equity and Compliance at Northeast State was very informative. I really learned how federal laws do inform policy and ways policies are created through institutions. The many ways policy, compliance, and evaluation are important for changing cultures. There's been a ton of legislation that has led to these policy changes and hopefully an end to sexual violence on campus and interpersonal violence on campus. The culture of interpersonal violence was really interesting also to research, just understanding the significance of underreporting, how alcohol is correlated with sexual assault, the definition of consent and what college students understand as consent, and also how Title IX has been used to support sexual misconduct and interpersonal violence, as it can be a form of discrimination. I think for furthering my knowledge, I need to really be aware of the policy changes related to interpersonal violence. New legislation keeps happening. They are very detailed, very lengthy. There's a lot of ways that institutions need to be compliant. If I ever worked in this field, you would really have to know all of the policies and all the regulations and laws and acts in order to uphold compliance with your institution. I also learned more about the regulating bodies such as the Department of Education and Office of Civil Rights and how compliance officers work with those bodies to ensure that compliance is met. Overall, both internships were a great experience. I'd say the most learning I did was in the policy competency. I really enjoyed it. I think that when you do it every day, you become better at it, and I hope that I will one day work within policy to either support students, either in the form of case management or for survivors of sexual misconduct and interpersonal violence. Thank you.